lies from benevolent motives that under no circumstances should a lie be uttered. He defended radical honesty. A few years before, in 1792, speaking before the French National Assembly, the lawyer and leading figure of the French Revolution, Jean-Jacques Danton, stood up for boldness in all political areas. De l'audace, encore de l'audace, toujours de l'audace, audacity, then again audacity, always audacity. On the other side of the Channel, in London, William Blake proudly wrote in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, 1794, "Always be ready to speak your mind, and a base man will avoid you." Set in this context, the figure of Robert Burns stands as one of the most provocative figures among the poets of the time. From his first volume of poetry onward, poems chiefly in the Scottish Dialect, published in 1786, his wicked wit is put to good use to attack various forms of authorities. Consequently, in a historical context fraught with civil strife and wars among nations, and in the aftermath of the Habeas Corpus Suspension Act of 1794, Burns suffered from various aspects of the counter-revolutionary backlash, making it compulsory for him to find other means to speak out what he wanted to say about the state of the country. What strategies did he use to make his provocative voice heard? Indeed, Burns was provocative in the public sphere as well as in the private and in the poetic ones. He chose to speak out unpalatable opinions and subversive statements, even at the cost of his own social and political comfort. Plain truth to speak is a quotation from Epistle to John Lapraik. And that might be his motto. But he has another one to offer, as we shall see. Such an outspokenness may be best described under the Greek term parrhesia, a term first used in a play by Euripides. The meaning of parrhesia ranges from to speak freely to boldness. And the French philosopher Michel Foucault explains, etymologically, parrhesia is the act of telling all, frankness, open-heartedness, plain speaking, speaking openly, speaking freely. And the outspoken speaker is called parrhesiast. Michel Foucault studied the historical evolution of parrhesia in the course of Greek, Latin and Christian philosophy. So I shall therefore study first some of Burns's parrhesiastic statements in a number of situations. I shall map 4 areas of parrhesiastic statements. Then I shall explore the various obstacles that Robert Burns met with in the course of his life, especially in the last years of his life. And then I shall develop the strategies, some of the strategies at least, that he has found to overcome these obstacles. So first, Robert Burns, the parrhesiastes. Let's focus more on various aspects of the definition of the parrhesiastic attitude according to Michel Foucault. So parrhesia is the frankness, freedom and openness that leads one to say what one has to say, as one wishes to say it, when one wishes to say it, and in the form one thinks is necessary for saying it. The term parrhesia is so bound up with the choice, decision and attitude of the person speaking that the Latins translated it by precisely libertas. The telling all of parrhesia was rendered by libertas, the freedom of the person speaking. And to translate parrhesia, libertas, into French, Michel Foucault uses franc-parler, speaking freely. And he explains that this is to him the most exact translation of the Greek term. There is another aspect, another facet to the term parrhesia. Parrhesia is, quote, the public and risky expression of a personal conviction, unquote, according to Michel Foucault. As such, the parrhesiastic attitude has tremendous consequences. To tell all that one deems to be the truth, implies to threaten the link with one's listeners, towards a friend, it may jeopardize friendship. Towards authority, the parrhesiast runs the risk of punishment, of imprisonment, even of death. The unpalatable truth the parrhesiast wishes to utter may unleash all kinds of violence, anger, fighting, wounds, and so on. In other terms, outspokenness requires courage, the courage to say, to utter disturbing truths without concession or demagogy. Parrhesia is the opposite of flattery. It destabilizes the listener, depriving him or her of any complacent verbal mirror. The parrhesiast agrees to be at risk and to undergo the repercussions of his or her speech. Tension is spontaneously triggered when the parrhesiast speaks, and listening to a parrhesiast may be like an ordeal. Listeners may cringe with impatience. Parrhesia entails scandals and polemics, such as those unleashed by cynic philosophers. Indeed, cynics like Diogenes often volunteer their own lives to be the drama of subversive truths. Parrhesiasts, by and large, tend to disquiet and irritate their audience. They advocate behaviors and opinions that question conventions. Kingly fools, such as the ones described by Erasmus in his praise of folly, or obviously Shakespeare's fools in Twelfth Night and King Lear, are other instances of subversive, outspoken figures. One of the characters in Burns's Love and Liberty boasts, "I am a fool by profession." Therefore, provocation is part and parcel of Burns's legend, as many testimonies show. To quote some of them, in his review of the first edition of poems, chiefly in the Scottish Dialect, in the Lounger, published in December the 9th, 1786, the novelist Henry Mackenzie regrets, quote, in Burns's poems, "a spirit of libertinism and irreligion," unquote, that can only be excused by, quote, "the ignorance and fanaticism of the lower class of people in the country where the poems were written," unquote. James Curry, one of Burns's earliest biographers, criticizes the boldness of Burns's rhymes and rhythms, and he depicts the poet thus. These singularities are increased by the character of the poet, who delights to express himself with a simplicity that approaches to nakedness, and with an unmeasured energy that often alarms delicacy, and sometimes offends taste. Hence, in approaching him, the first impression is perhaps repulsive. There is an air of coarseness about him, which is difficultly reconciled with our established notions of poetical excellence. The journalist and critic Francis Jeffrey considered that the use of Scottish words was a challenge to poetic decorum. Quote, "The odious slang infects almost all his prose and a very great proportion of his poetry," unquote. Jeffrey condemns the public persona of the poet. Quote, "He is perpetually making a parade of his thoughtlessness, inflammability, and imprudence," unquote. Indeed, Burns displays his awareness of being a troublesome character in a number of poems, and I shall quote from Epistle to John Lapraik, "I will blow about myself, as ill I like my faults to tell, but friends and folk that wish me well, they sometimes ruse me, praise me, though I must own, as many still as far abuse me." Burns's boldness is also acknowledged among his friends, who endeavour to mitigate his fiery spirit. Writing shortly after his death, Maria Riddle is in two minds about praising or blaming his provocative tendency. Quote, "The keenness of satire was, I am almost at a loss whether to say his forte or his foible." One of his patrons, Mrs. Dunlop, encouraged him to leave polemical matters aside altogether. Burn replied in a letter, "Your criticisms, madam, I understand very well, and could have wished to have pleased you better. You are right in your guesses that I am not very amenable to counsel. Poets much my superiors have so flattered those who possessed the adventitious qualities of wealth and power, that I am determined to flatter no created being, either in prose or verse, so help me God. I set as little by kings, lords, clergy, critics, and so on, as all these respectable gentry do by my bardship. Burns is eager to mention his Parrhesiastic ancestors in the poetic field. He loves the satires of Alexander Pope and Robert Fergusson. The Scottish poet Robert Fergusson wrote religious and political satires, Home Content, a satire, as well as literary satires such as The Soul of Feeling, which caricatures Henry Mackenzie's 1771 The Man of Feeling. One of Burns's models is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who constantly unsettled the political consensus among monarchies in his essays. Rousseau's The Social Contract, 1762, for instance, was burnt in Paris and in his native town, Geneva. Rousseau replied by writing that he was zealous in his pursuit of truth and that he was ready to sacrifice his person to his ideas. Burns believes that this tendency to speak freely is a trait of the Scottish people. In The Two Dogs, the dog Luath describes a phenomenon similar to parrhesia as common among Scottish peasantry. And this is the first quotation that you have on the handout. They, peasants, lay aside their private cares to mind the kirk and state affairs. They'll talk of patronage and priests with kindling fury in their breasts, or tell what new taxation's coming, and furly at the folk in London. The Scottish bard is fully aware of the risks run by those who boldly speak of political or religious matters in public, but he considers it his duty to participate in the public debate. I'm going to read the following quotation from the handout. The fear of hell's a hangman's whip to hold the wretch in order, but where you feel your honour grip, let that eye be your border. Its slightest touches, instant pause, debar aside pretences, and resolutely keep its laws, uncaring consequences. The Parrhesia honour honesty stands for a cluster of core values for Burns. The two words work as a kind of moral compass. His boldness resounds in the last line of the quotation, uncaring consequences. So he's well aware of the risk that he's running by uttering his political and religious statements. So despite or beyond religious anathema and political pressure. Michel Foucault highlights the role of the occasion, in Greek kairos, in the practice of parrhesia, to seize the moment, to seize the right time to utter one's statements. So of course, having one's name on a book of poetry in which several poems deride the monarchy and the church in a time of political turmoil, entailed courage. In Epistle to Mr. Titler of Woodhouseley, Burns writes, "But politics, truce, we're on dangerous ground. Who knows how the fashions may alter? The doctrines today that our loyalty sound, tomorrow may bring us a halter." Between the first edition of the poems published in 1786 and the third edition published in 1793, the French Revolution and warfare on sea and land could not be ignored in Great Britain. Henry Dundas, 1st Viscount Melville, nicknamed the Grand Manager of Scotland and the uncrowned King of Scotland, was named Home Secretary, then Secretary of State for War, by the Prime Minister William Pitt. In 1793, Great Britain declared war on the young French Republic. In 1794, the habeas corpus was suspended. In the same year, William Wickham was in charge of strengthening the internal network of security services against radical agents. And there's this funny anecdote of Wordsworth and Coleridge about to be sent to prison because they were talking, they were walking in the countryside, and a state agent was overhearing their conversation, and they were talking about Spinoza, which they were pronouncing Spinoza, And the agent believed that they were talking about spies, and so Coleridge described the anecdote in Biographia Literaria about this spy nosy thing. So in 1795, 2 laws prohibited debating societies considered to be places of sedition against the regime. And Burns was, of course, well aware of this dangerous context. And this is perhaps, so he writes in 1794 to a correspondent, "If Mr. Perry, whose honour after your character of him I cannot doubt, if he will give me an address and channel by which anything will come safe from those spies with which he may be certain that his correspondence is beset, I will now and then send him any bagatelle that I may write." So this quick historical reminder shows that Burns's opinions were particularly dissonant in such a context. He was a big mouth, as in the sense used by Peter Sloterdijk, who studied the Cynics, when Peter Sloterdijk describes the Cynics in ancient Greece. Robert Burns's political opinions are rather complex. To put it simply, in a nutshell, he is a Jacobite and a Jacobin. As a Jacobite, he leaned towards the independence of Scotland. As a Jacobin, he supported the Whig Party most of the time. He was particularly aggressive against the English monarchy and the religious establishment. So now I shall study 4 areas in which Burns' the Parrhesiastes can be more easily be heard. So first, mocking the aristocracy, the English aristocracy, of course, English monarchy. So the first poem of the 1786 volume, The Two Dogs, derides the aristocracy and the fashion of the Grand Tour. This is the 3rd quotation from the handout, where he describes how aristocrats behave in the Grand Tour. At operas and plays parading, mortgaging, gambling, masquerading, or maybe in a frolic daft, to Hague or Calais takes a waft, to make a tour and take a whirl, to learn bon ton and see the world. There at Vienna or Versailles, he rides his father's olden tales, or by Madrid he takes the route to thrum guitars and fight with note, or down Italian vista startles, or whore hunting among groves of myrtles, then bows drummy German water to make himself look fair and fatter, and clear the consequential sorrows, love gifts of carnival signoras. For Britain's good, for her destruction, with dissipation, feud, and faction. Later on in the poem, he also indulges in unveiling the licentious morals of aristocratic ladies, quotation which is not in the handout. The ladies arm in arm in clusters, as great and gracious as sisters, but here their absent thoughts of either, their rondeals and jabs together, wise o'er the wee bit cup and platy, they sip the scandal potion pretty, or lilac knights with crabbit looks, pour o'er the devil's pictures books, stake on a chance a farmer's stackyard, and cheat like any unhanged blackguard. Adultery, lies, gossips, and scandals. Burns, in this poem, contrasts the life of dissipation of the aristocracy with the difficult but virtuous life of Scottish peasants. In a similar vein, the poem A Dream is perhaps a little bit more ferocious still. The poet addresses the English king and roundly criticizes the monarchy. The speaker, so Burns as a speaker, had a dream. As a modest peasant, he is present at the king's levee. As soon as His Majesty opens his eyes, the poet lectures him on the way the king rules his kingdom. First, the kingdom's finances are in dire straits. This is well known. The excess of taxes has led to the loss of the American colonies. The speaker insinuates that the highest persons in charge are to be blamed. But the speaker goes on, this comes as no surprise, as the king cannot even rule over his own family. Burns mocks the Prince of Wales's deportments, and he evokes the Queen and their daughters' physiological problems, constipation. Mrs. Dunlop, a friend of Burns's, warned him against railing at the royal family. Quote from Mrs. Dunlop in a letter, "I ought to have told you that numbers at London are learning Scots to read your book, but they don't like your address to the king and say it will hurt the sale of the rest." Unquote. According to her, Burns ought to suppress this poem in future editions. Burns replied that he would do no such thing. So your criticisms, madam, I understand very well and could have wished to have pleased you better. You are right in your guesses that I am not very amenable to counsel. For my dream, which has unfortunately incurred your loyal displeasure, probably pun on royal displeasure, loyal displeasure, I hope to have the honour of appearing at Dunlop in its defence in person. In the very famous poem Is There for Honest Poverty, Song for All That and All That, published in 1795 in the radical newspaper The Glasgow Magazine, Burns, like Diogenes the Cynic, manages a transmutation of common values. He opposes form and substance. The rank is but the guinea stamp, the man's the goal for all that. The man of independent mind couldn't care less about fops, Berkeys. Lines 17 to 20, so you've got the quotation on the handout at the bottom of the first page. Ye see yon Berkey, so foolish posturer, called the Lord, who struts and stares and all that. The hundreds worship at his word, he's but a coof for all that, so a fool. The poet turns the social hierarchy on its head and establishes a new set of values. Lines 15 and 16. The honest man, the heir so poor, is king of men for all that. By and large, Burns describes English aristocracy as demovorous. That is to say, after this word used by Rabelais, that is to say, devouring its own people. An idea with many visual equivalents, quite popular in the newspaper iconography of the last decade of the 18th century, as well as at the beginning of the 19th century. See, for instance, James Gilray's The Plum Pudding in Danger. The royals and the aristocracy do not constitute Burns's sole target. The political world is another one. In the author's Earnest Cry and Prayer, published in 1786, the speaker denounces political frauds intended on promoting English beer over Scottish whisky. The glib speaker of the poem challenges the powers that be. Quote, unquote, from lines 19 to 20, "Stand forth and tell yon premier youth the honest, open, naked truth." So he's ready to speak freely, frankly. The speaker despises the art of feigning. "The muckle devil blow you south if ye dissemble." Lines 23-24. Burns's boldness here is conspicuous on various levels. First, a peasant presents himself as a representative of the people. Second, he puts forward the people's grievances, a practice which was going to have tremendous consequences, of course, when implemented in France in 1789. Like the immense portion of the people, Burns could not vote. He did not have the money to pay for his participation in the elections. Consequently, poems taking the form of pamphlets peppered with humour were one of the best ways of making his voice heard. In the same poem, the author's Earnest Cry and Prayer, he speaks, I quote, "to the right honourable and honourable the Scotch representatives in the House of Commons," and he mocks the Whig representative Charles Fox's dissolute way of life. In another public statement, he denounces the social union associating Scotland and England. He takes up these arguments in an open letter addressed to William Pitt himself, published in the newspaper The Edinburgh Evening Courant on February the 9th, 1789. This is a simple plea, this is a direct plea for Scotland. I quote, "But turn your eyes, sir," William Pitt, "to the tragic scenes of our fate, an ancient nation that for many ages had gallantly maintained the unequal struggle for independence with her much more powerful neighbour, at last agrees to a union which should ever after make them one people. In consideration of certain circumstances, it was solemnly covenanted that the former should always enjoy a stipulated alleviation in her share of the public burdens, particularly in that branch of the revenue known by the name of the excise. Ironically enough, the position of exciseman was to become Burns's job. Third area, after mocking the aristocracy, mocking politicians, mocking religion. Thanks to his father's readings of the Bible during meal times, and of course his personal knowledge of the Bible, Burns was extremely well versed in biblical allusions and quotations and anecdotes. He therefore met religious representatives on their own grounds. Address to the Deal does not only poke fun at what he considered as a bogeyman, but it is also a strategy to debunk Presbyterian authorities, the old list authorities, who instrumentalized the devil to strike fear in the souls of the brethren. Deaf and Dr. Hornbook recalls that listeners should take their preacher's words with a pinch of salt. I quote from the second page of the handout, page 2, top of the page. Some books are lies from end to end, and some great lines were never penned. Even ministers, they have been kent in holy rapture, arousing wit line at times to vent, and nail it with scripture. Epistles to James Smith, another poem, stigmatizes religious corruption, while the Holy Fair is displays a carnivalesque spirit which undermines religious seriousness. Holy Willie's prayer unveils religious hypocrisy, a hypocrisy which is called by Burns the better art of hiding, in address to the Unco Git. Fourth area of mockery by Burns, the conventions he likes to flout. So as I have shown in my article about Burns's Ars Poetica, and I'm delighted in writing Ars with an E at the end, okay? So published in Études Anglaises, Burns likes to flout conventions and he speaks freely about sexual topics and bodily fluids. At no time is this a gratuitous indulgence of a vulgar poet. As I have intended to show, this is a carefully calculated strategy to denounce social hypocrisy, a carnivalesque enterprise to debunk political hierarchies and reassert the humanity of mankind, which resounds in his song like a motto, a man's a man for all that. And to quote just one song and poem, we could say that why should not poor folk mow is a case in point of this political strategy of blending the sexual and the political. So as I have mentioned, over the last years of his life, civil strife, wars, a number of political events have made the statements of subversive political and religious statements more difficult. In 1786, Burns could pretend that a dream was only a virtual criticism of the monarchy, because it was only a dream, okay, virtual. So he expected not to be indicted for treason. But 7 years later, it had become extremely risky to mock the royals, to mock the monarchy, without being imprisoned, deported, or executed. In 1787, Burns could boast, in a letter he wrote, "My motto is I dare," in capital letters with an exclamation mark. But after 1789, and more specifically after 1791, he earned his life as an exciseman, a job he detested, but that he had chosen so as to take care of his numerous children. He took care even of those he had had out of wedlock. To a friend who offered to publish some of his subversive pamphlets and poems, Burns wrote more prudently in 1794, "Your letter is indeed truly generous, and most sincerely do I thank you for it. But in my present situation, I find that I dare not accept it. You well know my political sentiments, and were I an insular individual, unconnected with a wife and a family of children, with the most fervid enthusiasm I would have volunteered my services. I then could and would have despised all consequences that might have ensued. My prospect in the excise is something. At least it is encumbered as I am with the welfare, the very existence of near half a score of helpless individuals, what I dare not sport with. In the meantime, they are most welcome to my ode, only let them insert it as a thing they have met with by accident and unknown to me. In a letter to the Morning Chronicle, published on January the 1st, 1795, under the pseudonym of Britain, he sums up the political situation for political opponents of the regime as such, as follows. At this moment, you and I are subject to be seized and confined without having a right to demand a trial. For when a minister can send his maréchaussée into your house and take you in silence to a dungeon, what security can you have against a transport into a distant region? So as Michel Foucault recalls, parrhesia does not produce a codified effect. It opens up an unspecified risk. And this unspecified risk is obviously a function of the elements of the situation. Parrhesia is a risk for the person who states it, a risk accepted by the person who states it. Of course, accepting the risk does not mean running into the lion's den. So consequently, Burns had to be more calculating in the risks he was willing to take. He had to resort to new strategies to maintain his subversive spirit and to protect his person and his relatives at the same time. So the first strategy is to seek for the protection of patrons. But of course, knowing patrons and influential protectors might prove an uneasy collaboration. As a critic recalls, the support of the support of patrons from the superior class, though essential, was often obtained at a heavy cost. In a counter-revolutionary climate, this generally included having to exercise personal deference and to espouse politically conservative sentiments. As opposed to this attitude, in the preface to the 1787 edition of his poems, Burns denounces prostituted learning, and he underlines his specificity, independence. In Epistle to a Young Friend, he writes, I was bred to the plough and am independent, and he praises again the glorious privilege of being independent. Flattery, as he expresses in a number of poems, is to be avoided at all costs. In Epistle to Davy, a brother poet, he writes, flattery I detest. And in this poem he makes a pun on flattery and flat to designate a base mind. So low I need not bow, he writes in a dedication to Gavin Hamilton Esquire. This is why Burns, in his recourse to protectors, endeavoured to maintain and even stipulate his independence. He would rather beg than to offer to flatter anyone. And in a dedication to Gavin Hamilton Esquire, Burns manages to offer his allegiance to his patron while asserting his freedom of opinion. This is the following quotation on the handout. Expect not, sir, in this narration, a fleeting, threatening dedication, so wheedling flattering, to ruse you up and call you good, and sprung of great and noble blood, because ye surname like his grace, perhaps related to the race. Then when I'm tied, and so are you, with many a fulsome, sinful lie, set up a face how I stop short, for fear your modesty be hurt. This may do, sir, with them who must please the great folk for a wainful, for a bellyful. For me, so low I need not bow, for low be thank it, I can plough, and when I down a yoke nay, then, Lord be thank it, I can beg. So I shall say, and that's no flattering, it's just sick poet and sick patron. In the final lines of this excerpt, the conclusion of the excerpt, it's just sick poet and sick patron. They are put on an equal footing, and it underlines the equivalence between the poet and his protector. The parallelism is highlighted by the alliteration, the italics, the syntax, and perhaps in the sick poet and sick patron we can also hear the Latin sic, thus suggesting beyond the equivalence an equality, between a social equality between the poet and his patron. This is a motif which is also expressed line 125 of the same poem. Make you as poor a dog as I am. Burns is proud to say that he's not bound to his patron by any financial string, which would be tantamount to corruption for Burns. This is an idea that he expresses, for instance, when he collected songs and George Thompson offered to pay him, and Burns replied famously, "As to any remuneration, you may think my songs either above or below price, for they shall absolutely be the one or the other. In the honest enthusiasm with which I embark in your undertaking, to talk of money, wages, fear, high, and so on, would be downright sodomy of soul." So he's not bound up with any financial string, but by friendship alone. His patron is his friend, not his superior, and he makes it clear in the last line of the poem, "Then, sir, your hand, my friend and brother." Friend and brother are capitalized. But the political context is so dangerous that Burns is led to have recourse to other strategies, the use of pseudonyms or to publish anonymous articles. So for instance, here is a list of some of the pseudonyms that he uses. Thomas O'Reimer, John Barleycorn, Tom Nettle, a Briton Agricola. These pseudonyms reveal many facets that were dear to the heart of Burns. His identity as a poet, Thomas O'Reimer, as a peasant, John Barleycorn, but also someone who knows that his opinions might prove stinging, Nettle, Tom Nettle. So as I said, sometimes he preferred to remain anonymous, which makes it difficult for scholars to assert Burns' authorship for some articles and led to heavy debates among scholars. For instance, Ode to the Departed Regency Bill was published under the pseudonym of Agricola in the London Star in 1789. This is a biting satire of the political life of his time. When he had it published, Burns explained to his friend the risk he was running. This is the last quotation of the handout. "I have this moment finished the following political squib. Politics is dangerous ground for me to tread on, and yet I cannot for the soul of me resist an impulse of anything like wit." In other terms, Burns is in the same position as Ovid, for instance, who was sent into exile, or he is ready to suffer the fate of Kundera's student protagonist in the joke. Another strategy used by Burns is to displace the temporal frame of the poem criticizing the monarchy, for instance. Scott's Uha, published in 1793, takes the form of a speech given by Rob the Bruce before the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. And the famous lines, "Tyrants fall in every foe, liberties in every blow, let us do or die," are obvious echoes of the political context of the French Revolution, but also Scottish political elements. A final strategy that I would like to mention is not to publish some of the poems that might sound too controversial, too radical in the very political context, probably in hopes that better times will allow the poem to be published. These poems form what the critic Jared Carruthers has called Burns' reserved canon. Not so reserved, however, as Burns had some of his articles and poems passed among his friends and acquaintances, Holy Willie's Prayer being a case in point. Some poems remained hidden in drawers for several decades, such as Burns' Ode for General Washington's Birthday, published in 1874, but composed in 1794. The poem links back the American Republic to Greek democracy in the antiquity. Burns contrasts the freedom enjoyed by American citizens to Britain's state censorship and political oppression. I quote from lines 26 to 28. "Columbia's offspring, brave as free, in danger's hour still flaming in the van, ye know and dare maintain the royalty of man." So in the final expression, the royalty of man, you can see again how Burns turns the social hierarchy upside down. And perhaps the gradual publication of Burns' poems contributed to have his voice heard over the first half and even the second half of the 19th century. So as a conclusion, despite the fraught political context during the years of the French Revolution, Burns maintained his friendship with radical thinkers who shared his political opinions, to name but a few, Mary Wollstonecraft, Robert Riddle, William Maxwell. He found strategies to keep his political voice heard. As a reaction against Burns's free thinking and loud voice, many people, including some of his allies, some of his first editors, such as James Carey, have tried to sanitize him, to neuter his bawdy songs, his bawdy poems and songs, even to discredit him and to discard him as a drunkard. But that is another story. Poet, songwriter, song collector, journalist, Burns commented tirelessly on his time and his contemporaries, and he constantly challenged the powers that be, the English aristocracy, the politicians, the religious establishment. From a temporal perspective, from temporal distance, Burns might appear as a figure of the committed intellectual, even before the notion existed. Thank you for attention.